In the middle of the 18th century, France was ruled by King Louis XV, a monarch who sat on a throne supported by tradition, religion, and absolute authority. To harm the king was not just a crime against a man. It was an attack on God, the state, and the natural order itself. In this world, punishment was not about correction. It was about spectacle. Justice had to be seen, felt, and feared. And no execution in French history would ever embody that philosophy more brutally than the death of François Damiens. François Damiens was not a powerful noble, not a famous revolutionary, and not a mastermind plotting the fall of a kingdom. He was a servant, a former soldier, a man of low status who drifted through jobs and cities. Accounts describe him as unstable, deeply religious, and obsessed with the idea that the king was leading France toward moral ruin. On a January day in 1757, Damiens managed to approach King Louis XV at Versailles. In his hand was a small penknife. He struck the king once. The wound was shallow. The blade barely broke the skin. The king survived. But in the eyes of the law, the damage had already been done. The attack sent shockwaves through France. An attempt on the king's life was the ultimate crime. Damiens was immediately seized, beaten, and dragged away. From that moment on, his fate was sealed. What followed was not simply an execution, but a carefully planned demonstration of royal power, designed to erase any thought of rebellion from the public mind. Damiens was taken to prison, where he was subjected to months of interrogation. These were not polite questioning sessions. Torture was a legal tool, used to extract confessions and names of accomplices. Officials were convinced that Damiens could not have acted alone. Surely there had to be a conspiracy. Surely enemies of the crown were hiding in the shadows. Damiens insisted again and again that he acted alone. His words did not satisfy his captors. His flesh was burned with hot irons. His limbs were crushed with devices designed to shatter bone without killing him. He was deprived of sleep. He was threatened with even worse suffering. Yet no matter how much pain was inflicted, no grand conspiracy emerged. In the end, the authorities accepted the truth, not because they believed him, but because there was nothing else to extract. The sentence was announced, and it was meant to terrify. Damiens would be executed in the Place de Grève in Paris, the traditional site of public punishment. But this would not be a simple hanging or beheading. This would be the ultimate penalty reserved for regicides. The execution would last as long as possible. Every stage would be visible. Every scream would serve as a warning. On the day of the execution, Paris overflowed with people. Vendors sold food and wine. Families brought children. This was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as justice. Damiens was brought out, weak, wounded, and barely able to stand. His body already bore the marks of months of torment. The execution began with ritual. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers, ripping away pieces from his chest, arms, and thighs. Molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and melted wax were poured into the open wounds. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Witnesses later wrote of the smoke, the screams, and the way the crowd reacted with a mix of horror and fascination. But this was only the beginning. Next came the punishment that would define the execution in history. Damiens was to be drawn and quartered. His limbs were tied to 4 horses, each pulling in a different direction. The goal was to tear his body apart. But reality did not cooperate with the plan. The horses strained. They pulled. They slipped on the blood-soaked ground. Damiens screamed, prayed, and begged for mercy. His body refused to break. Officials ordered the executioners to cut his joints with knives to help the horses. More blood spilled. Still, the limbs held. Hours passed. The crowd waited. The sun moved across the sky. The execution, meant to be swift in its stages, became agonizingly slow. At one point, witnesses noted that Damiens was still conscious, still speaking, still alive far longer than anyone expected. Some in the crowd began to feel uneasy. This was no longer a clear display of power. It was something else. Something excessive. Eventually, with further cutting and renewed effort from the horses, Damiens' limbs were torn from his body. What remained was burned to ashes. Those ashes were scattered to the wind. The message was clear. Not only would the king's enemies die, they would be erased. From start to finish, the punishment unfolded over an extended period, with preparations, torture, and execution forming a brutal process that stretched across days, culminating in a public spectacle that lasted for hours. In the collective memory, it became known as a 72-hour execution, not because every moment was spent in the square, but because the final phase of his punishment represented the end of a prolonged, relentless ordeal designed to destroy both body and soul. The reaction to Damiens' execution was complex. Some felt satisfaction. The king had been avenged. Order had been restored. But others were disturbed. Writers, philosophers, and ordinary citizens began to question whether such cruelty truly represented justice. One of those deeply affected was Michel Foucault, who would later open his famous work on punishment with a detailed description of this very execution. To him, Damiens' death symbolized an old world of power that ruled through pain and spectacle. Less than 35 years later, the French Revolution would erupt. The monarchy would fall. Public executions would continue, but they would change in nature. The guillotine, introduced as a more humane method, was in many ways a reaction to the excesses of punishments like that of Damiens. His suffering marked the end of an era, even if no one realized it at the time. Today, it is difficult to comprehend how such an event could be considered acceptable, let alone necessary. But history does not exist to comfort us. It exists to remind us what humans are capable of when power goes unquestioned and fear becomes policy. François Damiens was not a hero, and he was not a monster. He was a man whose actions triggered a response so extreme that it exposed the brutal heart of absolute authority. As you think about this story, remember the crowd in the square, the officials following orders, and the belief that pain could preserve a kingdom. Ask yourself what future generations will think of our own systems of justice. History is watching, just as those thousands watched in Paris on that cold day when cruelty was mistaken for strength.